I was told never to knock on my neighbor's door after midnight. I just found out the horrifying reason why. My landlord gave me exactly one rule when I moved into the apartment: never knock on 3B's door after midnight. He said it with this intensity that made me uncomfortable, standing in my new living room with the lease papers still in his hands. His name was Gordon Fisk, and he had the kind of face that suggested he'd seen things he couldn't unsee. I asked why, and he said some rules exist for good reasons, and I should trust him on this one. I signed the lease anyway because rent in the city was impossible, and this place was surprisingly affordable. The building was old, built in the 1920s, with high ceilings and original hardwood floors. My apartment was 3A, right next to the mysterious 3B. For the first 3 weeks, I never saw my neighbor. Never heard anything through the shared wall either, which was strange because these old buildings have thin walls. I could hear Mrs. Kapoor in 2A watching her television programs. I could hear the college students in 4B playing music. But 3B was silent. Complete silence, like nobody lived there at all. I'm a nurse who works night shifts at County General, so my schedule is backwards from most people. I'd come home around 7 in the morning, sleep during the day, wake up around 4 in the afternoon. The building was usually quiet during my waking hours, which I appreciated. I'd make dinner, watch some television, maybe read before heading back to work at 11. It was a lonely routine, but I'd gotten used to it after my divorce. My ex-husband Daniel had gotten the house, the car, most of our friends. I'd gotten the student loan debt and the freedom to start over. Some days the freedom felt more like isolation, but I was working on that. One evening, about a month after moving in, I was leaving for my shift when I saw someone in the hallway. A woman, maybe in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. She was unlocking the door to 3B, struggling with the key. I offered to help, and she jerked away from me so violently she dropped her purse. Contents spilled across the hallway floor. I bent to help her gather things, and she said, "Don't touch anything," in a voice that was cold and sharp. I backed away with my hands up, apologizing. She collected her belongings quickly, her movements frantic and disorganized. She got the door open and disappeared inside without another word. The door slammed, and I heard multiple locks engaging. I stood in the hallway feeling like I'd somehow done something wrong by trying to be neighborly. That was my first real interaction with the woman in 3B, and it set the tone for everything that followed. At work that night, I couldn't stop thinking about her reaction. The fear in her eyes when I'd reached for her purse. The way she'd recoiled from basic human contact. I mentioned it to my coworker, a woman named Prisha, who'd been a nurse for 20 years and had seen everything. She said some people are just private, that I shouldn't take it personally. But there was something else, something beyond privacy. That woman had been terrified. 2 weeks later, I came home from a particularly brutal shift. We'd lost a patient, a young mother with 3 kids, and I was emotionally drained. It was around 7:30 in the morning, and I just wanted to sleep. I was unlocking my door when I heard crying from 3B. Not loud crying, but the kind of soft, broken sobbing that suggests someone has been crying for hours. I stood in the hallway listening, debating what to do. The nurse in me wanted to check if she was okay, but Gordon's warning echoed in my head. Never knock after midnight. It wasn't after midnight, though. It was morning. Surely the rule didn't apply during daylight hours. I knocked gently on her door and called out, asking if she needed help. The crying stopped immediately. Silence stretched for maybe 30 seconds. Then her voice came through the door. "Go away." Just those 2 words, flat and emotionless. I said I was her neighbor and I'd heard her crying and wanted to make sure she was all right. She said, "I'm fine. Leave me alone." I stood there feeling helpless and intrusive. I went back to my apartment and tried to sleep, but the sound of that crying stayed with me. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing patterns. The woman in 3B left her apartment every Wednesday at exactly 3 in the afternoon. She'd be gone for 2 hours, always returning at 5. She received grocery deliveries every Sunday morning. She never had visitors. The mailman would leave packages outside her door, and she'd wait until the hallway was empty before retrieving them. I wasn't trying to spy on her, but in a building this small, you notice these things. You notice when someone lives their life according to rigid schedules and careful avoidance of human contact. I wondered if she was agoraphobic or dealing with some kind of anxiety disorder. I wondered if she was lonely. I wondered if she was sick and needed help, but was too proud or too afraid to ask for it. Then one night in October, everything changed. I was coming home from my shift around midnight, exhausted and ready for bed. As I climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, I heard voices, male voices, coming from the direction of 3B. At least 2 men, maybe 3, speaking in low tones I couldn't make out. I reached the 3rd floor landing and froze. The door to 3B was slightly open, light spilling into the hallway. I could see shadows moving inside. I heard the woman's voice, higher pitched than normal, saying something about an agreement. One of the male voices responded, sharp and angry. I caught fragments. You know the rules. Time's almost up. Don't make this harder. I should have gone into my apartment and minded my own business. Should have remembered Gordon's warning. But the nurse in me, the part that's trained to help people in distress, wouldn't let me walk away. I stepped closer to 3B's door and cleared my throat. The voices stopped immediately. The door swung open and a man stepped into the hallway. He was tall, maybe 6'3", with broad shoulders and a face that looked like it had been broken and poorly reset multiple times. He stared at me with dark eyes that held no warmth. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice polite but with an edge underneath. I said I lived next door and heard raised voices, wanted to make sure everything was okay. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just a family discussion. Nothing to worry about." Another man appeared behind him, shorter but thicker, with hands that looked like they could crush concrete. He looked me up and down in a way that made my skin crawl. The first man said, "You should go inside now. It's late." It wasn't a suggestion. I glanced past them into 3B's apartment and saw the woman sitting on her couch, her face pale and drawn. She looked at me and I saw desperation in her eyes, but also something else. A warning. She gave the smallest shake of her head, so subtle I almost missed it. I said goodnight and went into my apartment, my hands shaking as I locked the door behind me. I stood with my ear pressed against the shared wall, listening. The voices resumed, quieter now. I couldn't make out words, just tones. Threatening tones. This went on for maybe 10 minutes. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway, multiple sets, heading toward the stairs. Silence followed. I waited 20 minutes, then knocked softly on the shared wall. No response. I almost knocked on her door, almost broke Gordon's rule right then, but something stopped me. That look she'd given me in the hallway. That warning. The next morning, I knocked on Gordon's apartment. He lived on the first floor in what used to be the building's superintendent unit. He opened the door in a bathrobe, looking annoyed. I asked him about the woman in 3B. Who was she? What was her story? Why had two dangerous-looking men been in her apartment at midnight? Gordon's face changed. The annoyance disappeared, replaced by something that might have been fear. He pulled me inside his apartment and closed the door. "What did you see?" he asked. I told him everything. The open door, the men, the threatening conversation, the way the woman had looked at me. Gordon sat down heavily on his couch and put his head in his hands. "I told you not to knock after midnight. I told you to stay away." I said I hadn't knocked. I'd just been coming home from work. He looked at me and said, "You need to understand something. That woman in 3B, her name is Vera Kozlov. She's been in that apartment for 30 years. And for 30 years, men come to her door every month on the 15th. Always after midnight. Always the same routine." I asked what they wanted and Gordon said, "I don't know exactly. But I know it's not good. I know people who've tried to intervene before." He paused, his face grim. "They don't live in this building anymore." I felt cold spreading through my chest. I asked what he meant, and he said some things are better left alone. That Vera had made her choices a long time ago and we couldn't save her from them. I told him that was insane, that if something criminal was happening, we should call the police. Gordon laughed, a bitter sound. "You think the police don't know? You think nobody's ever called them? They come, they knock on her door, she tells them everything's fine, they leave. She won't press charges, won't even admit anything's wrong. What are they supposed to do?" I said there had to be something we could do. Gordon grabbed my arm, his grip tight enough to hurt. "Listen to me. Stay away from that apartment, especially after midnight. The 15th is in 3 days. When those men come, you stay in your apartment with your door locked and your music playing loud enough that you can't hear anything. Do you understand?" I pulled my arm away and said I understood, but I was lying. I couldn't just ignore what I'd seen. Over the next 3 days, I researched Vera Kozlov, found almost nothing online. No social media presence, no public records except the apartment lease. I talked to other tenants in the building, carefully, casually. Mrs. Kapoor in 2A had been there almost as long as Vera. She said Vera used to be different, 30 years ago when she first moved in. Used to smile, used to say hello in the hallways. Then something changed. Mrs. Kapoor wouldn't say what, just that Vera became a ghost, a shadow, someone who barely existed. The college kids in 4B had only been there 6 months and had never even seen Vera. They said 3B was the quiet apartment, the one that never made noise or caused problems. They had no idea anyone even lived there. I found a newspaper article from 1994, a small piece buried in the local section. A man named Viktor Kozlov had been found dead in his apartment on the south side of the city. Suspected suicide. Survived by his wife, Vera. No other details. I showed the article to Prisha at work and asked if she thought it meant anything. She said grief could do strange things to people, could make them withdraw from the world entirely. But that didn't explain the men who visited every month. That didn't explain the fear in Vera's eyes. The night of the 15th arrived. I came home from my shift at 11:30, my nerves jangling with anticipation and dread. I went into my apartment and locked the door. Turned on music, not too loud, but loud enough to cover any sounds from the hallway. I sat on my couch and watched the clock. Midnight came and went. 12:15, 12:30. Maybe Gordon had been wrong. Maybe the pattern had changed. Then at 12:40, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Multiple sets, heavy and deliberate. I turned off my music and moved to the door, pressing my ear against it. Knocking on 3B's door, firm and insistent. Vera's voice, muffled through the walls, saying something I couldn't make out. The door opening. Male voices, the same ones I'd heard before. I cracked my door open just enough to see into the hallway. 3 men this time, not 2. The tall one I'd seen before, the shorter, thick one, and a third man I hadn't seen. This one was older, maybe in his 60s, with silver hair and an expensive suit that looked out of place in this building. The door to 3B was open and they were inside. I heard the older man's voice, clearer than the others. 30 years, Vera. The debt is almost paid, just a few more months. Vera's voice, strained and breaking. You said 5 years. You promised me 5 years and then I'd be free. The older man laughed. I promised your husband 5 years. He's dead. The debt transferred to you. That's how this works. I stood frozen in my doorway, my mind racing to understand what I was hearing. Some kind of loan? Some kind of agreement that had lasted 3 decades? I heard sounds of movement, something being dragged across the floor. Vera crying, begging them to stop. The tall man's voice, cold and matter-of-fact. You know what happens if you don't cooperate. You know what we'll do. I couldn't stand there and listen anymore. I stepped fully into the hallway and said, I've called the police. They're on their way. It was a lie, but I said it with enough conviction that for a moment, the men inside 3B froze. Then the older man appeared in the doorway. He looked at me with eyes that had seen too much and felt too little. No, you haven't. And even if you did, it wouldn't matter. This is between us and Vera. Go back inside. I said whatever they were doing to her was illegal, and they needed to leave. The tall man stepped into the hallway, moving toward me. You're the nurse from next door, the one who works night shifts at County General, the one whose ex-husband lives on Maple Street with his new girlfriend. My blood went cold. They'd been watching me, gathering information about me. The older man smiled. We know everything about everyone in this building. We know Gordon in 1A owes $30,000 in gambling debts. We know Mrs. Kapoor in 2A sends money to her daughter in prison. We know the college kids in 4B are selling prescription pills they steal from the pharmacy where one of them works. Everyone has secrets. Everyone has debts. You want to be smart? You'll go back inside and forget you saw anything. I should have been terrified. Part of me was. But a larger part was angry. Angry that these men thought they could threaten me. Angry that they'd been doing this to Vera for 30 years and nobody had stopped them. I pulled out my phone and actually called 911 this time. The operator answered and I said I needed police at my address, that there were intruders threatening a resident. The men heard me talking and the older one's face hardened. He said, You just made a serious mistake. Then they walked past me to the stairs, unhurried, casual, not worried at all about the police I'd called. I went to Vera's open door and looked inside. She was sitting on her couch, the same place I'd seen her last time, crying. Her apartment was sparse and dated, furniture from decades ago, walls that hadn't been painted in years. It smelled like old cigarettes and despair. I asked if she was okay, and she looked at me with tears streaming down her face. You shouldn't have done that. You don't know what you've started. I said the police were coming, that she needed to tell them what these men were doing. She shook her head. The police can't help me. Nobody can help me. I sat down next to her and asked what was going on. What debt? What did they want from her? Vera was quiet for a long time. Then she started talking. Her husband Victor had borrowed money from the wrong people 30 years ago. $100,000 to start a business that failed. When he couldn't pay it back, they'd come for him. Given him 5 years to repay the principal plus interest. Compounding interest that made the debt grow faster than he could pay it down. Victor had worked himself to death trying to pay them back. Literally worked himself to death. The heart attack that killed him had been brought on by stress and exhaustion. When he died, Vera thought the debt would die with him, but they'd come to her and said the debt was hers now, that she'd benefited from the borrowed money, lived in the apartment it had paid for, eaten food it had bought. Therefore, she was responsible. For 30 years, Vera had been paying them $500 a month. 30 years, $180,000 paid, and they said she still owed another $100,000. The math didn't make sense, but that was the point. The debt was designed to never end. The police arrived 15 minutes later. 2 officers, a man and a woman, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. They took statements from both of us. I described the men, their threats, what I'd overheard. Vera sat silent, her hands folded in her lap, saying nothing. The male officer asked if she wanted to press charges against the men who'd been in her apartment. Vera said no, said they were old family friends who'd been helping her with some financial matters. The officer looked at me, then at Vera, clearly not believing her story but unable to do anything about it. He said if there was a crime being committed, they needed her cooperation to investigate. Without her testimony, there was nothing they could do. After they left, I sat with Vera in her apartment. I asked why she'd lied to them, and she said, because they'll kill me if I don't. Not tonight, not tomorrow, but eventually. They'll make it look like an accident or a suicide, just like they did with Victor. I said we could get her into protective custody, get her away from these people. She laughed bitterly. Where would I go? I'm 73 years old with no money, no family, no one who cares if I live or die except as a source of income. This apartment is all I have. If I run, they'll find me. If I talk to the police, they'll kill me. I've survived 30 years by following the rules, by paying them every month, by keeping quiet. You just put me in danger by calling attention to this. I felt helpless and frustrated. I asked if she knew who these men were, if they had names, if there was any way to identify them. Vera said the older man was called Sokolov. The others were just muscle, interchangeable enforcers who did what they were told. Sokolov ran a loan operation that had been functioning in this city for 40 years. Everyone knew about it. The police knew about it. But Sokolov was careful, never left evidence, never made direct threats that could be recorded. And his victims, people like Vera, were too scared to testify. The system that should have protected them had failed so completely that they'd given up hoping for help. I left Vera's apartment around 3 in the morning, exhausted and angry and unsure what to do next. I tried to sleep but couldn't. Kept thinking about Vera's face, about 30 years of being trapped in a debt that would never end. I thought about Victor, working himself to death trying to pay off money that probably should have been discharged in bankruptcy. I thought about Sokolov and his men, operating with impunity because the system allowed them to. The next morning, I went back to Gordon's apartment. He opened the door, saw my face, and said, "You didn't stay out of it." I said no, I didn't, and now I needed his help. Gordon let me in reluctantly. I asked him what he knew about Sokolov. He said what everyone knew, that Sokolov had connections everywhere, police, judges, politicians, that people who borrowed from him never got free, that sometimes those people disappeared. I asked if he'd ever tried to help Vera, and he said once, years ago, he'd tried to organize tenants to go to the police together to present a unified complaint. 3 people had been willing to speak. All 3 had moved out within a month. 1 had left the city entirely. Gordon had received a visit from Sokolov's men after that. They'd made it clear that his gambling debts could be called in immediately if he didn't mind his own business. He'd been minding his business ever since. I asked if he was telling me there was nothing we could do, and he said that's exactly what he was telling me. That sometimes bad people win because the systems meant to stop them are too broken or too corrupt to function. That survival meant knowing when to fight and when to walk away. I told him I couldn't walk away. He said, "Then you're going to regret it." I spent the next week researching everything I could find about Sokolov. His real name was Dmitry Sokolov, 68 years old, immigrated from Russia in the 1970s. He owned several businesses, all legitimate on paper. A restaurant, a car dealership, a property management company. But everyone knew the businesses were fronts for his real operation, which was lending money at predatory rates to desperate people. I found online forums where people discussed their experiences with illegal loans. Found dozens of stories similar to Vera's. People trapped in cycles of debt that lasted decades. People who'd had their businesses destroyed, their families threatened, their lives ruined. And nobody seemed able to stop him. I reached out to a reporter at the city newspaper, a woman named Keisha who specialized in investigative journalism. I told her about Vera and Sokolov, gave her all the information I'd gathered. She said she'd look into it but warned me that stories like this were hard to publish. Sokolov had sued newspapers before for defamation. Without victims willing to go on record, without documentation that could withstand legal scrutiny, there was nothing she could print. I asked what it would take to build a case strong enough to publish, and she said multiple victims willing to testify, financial records proving the illegal loans, evidence of threats or violence. I had none of those things. Vera wouldn't testify. I couldn't access financial records, and threats made verbally left no evidence. 2 weeks later, on a Friday night, I came home from work to find a note taped to my apartment door. Simple white paper with typed text. "Mind your own business or you'll regret it." My hands shook as I tore it down. I went inside and locked the door, my heart pounding. They were watching me. Knew where I lived, knew my schedule. The threat was clear. I could have stopped then. Should have stopped. But the image of Vera's face, the resignation in her eyes, the acceptance of 3 decades of exploitation, it wouldn't leave me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the note, about Sokolov's men coming to my door, about what they might do if I continued investigating. I thought about calling Daniel, my ex-husband, asking for advice. But we hadn't spoken in 6 months, and I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing I needed help. Around 2 a.m, I heard movement in the hallway. Footsteps, careful and deliberate. I moved to my door and looked through the peephole. 2 figures in dark clothing standing outside Vera's apartment. Not knocking, just standing there. One of them pulled something from his pocket and started working on her lock. They were breaking in. I called 911 again, whispering into the phone that someone was breaking into my neighbor's apartment. The operator said officers were on their way. I watched through the peephole as they got the door open and went inside. I heard Vera scream, heard sounds of a struggle. I couldn't just stand there. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my door and stepped into the hallway. The door to 3B was open. I could see into the apartment. One man was holding Vera against the wall by her throat. The other was trashing her apartment, pulling drawers open, dumping contents on the floor. I shouted at them to stop, that the police were coming. The man holding Vera let her drop, and both men turned to look at me. I recognized the tall one from before. He smiled. "The nurse. Sokolov wants to talk to you." They moved toward me and I swung the bat, connecting with the tall one's shoulder. He grunted but barely seemed fazed. He grabbed the bat and yanked it from my hands, then shoved me against the wall. "You're coming with us." Before they could grab me, I heard sirens. The police arriving faster than I'd expected. The men looked at each other, then ran for the back stairs. I heard them pounding down the steps as officers came up the front. Vera was on the floor of her apartment, coughing, rubbing her throat. I knelt beside her and asked if she was okay. She looked at me with a mixture of fear and something that might have been gratitude. The police took statements again. This time there was evidence. Vera's apartment had been broken into. There were marks on her throat from being choked. I'd witnessed the assault. But when the officer asked Vera if she wanted to press charges, if she could identify her attackers, she said no. Said she didn't get a good look at them. Said she couldn't be sure who they were. The officer looked frustrated but couldn't force her to cooperate. He gave both of us his card and said to call if we remembered anything else. After they left, I sat with Vera again. I asked why she kept protecting these people, and she said, "Because I want to live. Because I'm old and tired and I just want to survive a few more years in peace. You don't understand what it's like to be this scared for this long." I said I was trying to understand, trying to help. She grabbed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Then stop. Stop asking questions. Stop calling the police. Stop making this worse. They'll kill you. They'll kill both of us. Please, just let it go." I promised her I would. I was lying again. The next day I called Keisha, the reporter, and told her about the break-in. She said it was good, it was evidence, but it still wasn't enough without Vera's testimony. I asked what would be enough, and she said, "A recording. Get them on tape making threats or admitting to the illegal loans. That's something I could print and something the police couldn't ignore." I asked how I was supposed to get a recording, and she said, "That's up to you. But if you do, I'll make sure it gets published." I thought about it for 3 days. Thought about the risks, about what Sokolov's men might do if they caught me. Thought about Vera, about 3 decades of living in fear. Thought about all the other people trapped in similar situations. I decided to do it. I bought a small digital recorder online, the kind that could fit in a pocket and record for hours. On the 13th of the month, 2 days before Sokolov's next scheduled visit, I went to Vera's apartment and told her my plan. She looked at me with wide eyes and said, "You'll get us both killed." I said if I could get them on recording admitting to the threats and the illegal loans, Keisha could publish the story and the police would have to act. Public pressure would force them to investigate. Vera would be protected. Vera shook her head. "You're naive. You think one newspaper story will stop men who've been doing this for 40 years? You think the police will suddenly care?" I said it was worth trying. That doing nothing meant nothing would ever change. Vera was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "If you're going to do this, do it right. They come at 12:30 on the 15th. Always the same time. The older one, Sokolov, he likes to talk. Likes to make sure we understand our place. If you're recording, make sure you get everything he says." She gave me permission to hide the recorder in her apartment. I spent hours finding the right spot, testing the sound quality. Finally, I settled on placing it inside a decorative vase on a shelf that had a clear line to where Sokolov usually stood. The 15th arrived. I went to work for my shift but left at 11, claiming I felt sick. My supervisor wasn't happy but let me go. I drove home and parked a few blocks away, then walked to the building. I went to Vera's apartment at 11:45. She let me in, her face pale and drawn. I checked the recorder one more time, made sure it was running, then went to my own apartment. I left my door cracked open just enough to hear what happened in the hallway. Midnight came, 12:15, 12:30. Right on schedule, footsteps in the hallway, knocking on Vera's door, her voice muffled saying, "It's open." The door opening, multiple men entering. I heard Sokolov's voice, smooth and cultured. "Good evening, Vera. You have something for me?" Vera's voice shaking. "I can only give you 300 this month. I had medical bills." Sokolov's voice hardening. "Our agreement is 500. You know what happens when agreements aren't kept." I heard sounds of movement, someone walking around the apartment. The tall man's voice. "You expecting company? There's a recording device in here." My blood froze. They'd found it. I heard crashing sounds, something being smashed. Sokolov's voice cold with fury. "You're recording us? After 30 years you try to betray us?" Vera's voice panicked. "It wasn't me. I didn't put that there." The tall man again. "The nurse. Has to be the nurse next door. She was asking questions, making trouble." Sokolov said, "Bring her here." I heard footsteps coming toward my apartment and I ran for my door, trying to close and lock it. Too slow. The door burst open and the tall man grabbed me, dragging me into the hallway. I fought, kicking and scratching, but he was too strong. He pulled me into Vera's apartment and threw me onto the floor. Sokolov looked down at me with cold eyes. The helpful neighbor, the one who doesn't know when to mind her own business. He held up the crushed recorder. "Did you really think this would work? That a recording would stop us?" I said I'd already sent copies of other recordings to the police and the newspaper. Another lie, but I said it with desperate conviction. Sokolov laughed. "No, you didn't. But it doesn't matter. We're going to make sure you don't cause any more problems." He nodded to the tall man, who pulled out a syringe. I recognized it from the hospital, the kind used for sedation. I tried to scream, but another man clamped his hand over my mouth. I felt the needle go into my arm, felt cold spreading through my veins. My vision started to blur. The last thing I remember was Vera crying, saying, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." I woke up in a basement. Concrete floor, concrete walls, single bulb hanging from the ceiling. My head pounded and my mouth tasted like metal. I tried to move and realized my hands were zip-tied behind me to a metal chair. Panic flooded through me. I pulled at the restraints and only succeeded in making my wrists bleed. Sokolov entered the basement, alone this time. He pulled up another chair and sat across from me. "You've created a difficult situation. I don't like difficult situations." I asked what he was going to do with me, and he said that depended on me. That I had two choices. I could agree to stop interfering, stop asking questions, stop trying to help Vera, sign a document stating I'd made false allegations, and wouldn't pursue the matter further. If I did that, he'd let me go and we'd forget this happened. Or I could refuse, in which case they'd make me disappear. Stage it as a suicide or an accident. The police wouldn't look too hard. A divorced woman, living alone, working night shifts, struggling with depression. These things happen. I asked about Vera, and he said Vera was fine, back in her apartment, learning the cost of betrayal. Her monthly payment had just doubled. For helping me, for allowing the recorder in her apartment, she'd now pay $1,000 a month instead of $500. I felt sick. I said I'd sign whatever he wanted. Sokolov smiled. Smart choice. He had me sign a document, typed and official-looking, stating that I'd made false allegations about Mr. Sokolov and his business associates, that I was suffering from stress and paranoia, that I withdrew any complaints I'd made to police or media. My hands shook as I signed. He cut the zip ties and I rubbed my wrists, feeling circulation return. "You're free to go. My men will drive you home. And remember, we're always watching." They drove me home in the back of a black SUV with tinted windows, dropped me in front of my building at 4 a.m. I stumbled inside and up to my apartment, my legs barely working. I locked myself in and collapsed on my couch, shaking. I'd failed. Failed Vera. Failed all the other people Sokolov was exploiting. And I'd signed a document that made me complicit in my own silence. For the next week, I barely left my apartment. Called in sick to work, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every sound in the hallway made me jump. I kept expecting Sokolov's men to come back, to decide I was too much of a risk after all. Vera didn't answer when I knocked on her door. I left notes, asking if she was okay. No response. Mrs. Kapoor said she'd seen Vera leave one morning, but she'd looked thin and ill, like she'd aged 10 years overnight. On the 8th day, I got a call from Keisha, the reporter. She said she'd been trying to reach me, had left multiple voicemails. I apologized and said I'd been dealing with personal issues. She said she had news. That someone else had come forward about Sokolov. A man named Eugene who'd been trapped in the same kind of debt cycle. Eugene had recorded his own interactions with Sokolov's men, had documentation going back 5 years. Keisha said if I was still willing to add my testimony, if I could describe what happened to me, they might have enough for a story. I thought about the document I'd signed, thought about Sokolov's threats, thought about Vera paying double now because of me. I said I couldn't help, that I'd been mistaken about everything, that I needed to be left alone. Keisha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They got to you, threatened you or hurt you. I understand. But you should know, Eugene's testimony alone might not be enough. Without corroboration, Sokolov's lawyers will destroy him in court." I said I was sorry and hung up. I sat in my apartment feeling like the worst kind of coward. That night, I drank half a bottle of wine trying to quiet my thoughts. It didn't work. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that stopped outside my door. Knocking, firm and insistent. I froze, terror flooding through me. They'd come back. Sokolov had decided I was too much of a risk after all. The knocking continued. A voice called out, "Police, open the door." I looked through the peephole and saw 2 officers in uniform. I opened the door, confused. They asked if I was the resident of this apartment, and I said yes. They said there had been reports of drug activity in the building and they needed to search my apartment. I said they needed a warrant and they said they had one, showing me a document. I let them in, my mind reeling. Drug activity? I didn't do drugs. They searched methodically, going through my cabinets, my drawers, my closet. One of them pulled something from under my mattress, a plastic bag filled with white powder. He held it up and said, "What's this?" I said I'd never seen it before, that someone must have planted it. They didn't believe me, or pretended not to. I was arrested, handcuffed, read my rights, taken to the police station and processed. They said I was being charged with possession with intent to distribute. The bail was set at $50,000. I didn't have $50,000. I called my ex-husband from the holding cell. Daniel answered, heard my voice, and said, "What do you want?" I told him I'd been arrested, that drugs had been planted in my apartment, that I needed help. He said, "That sounds like a you problem," and hung up. I called my parents, but they were retired and living on fixed income, couldn't help with bail. I called Prisha from work and she said she'd try to help but couldn't promise anything. I spent 3 days in jail before Prisha managed to scrape together enough for a bail bondsman. When I got out, I went back to my apartment, found an eviction notice on my door. Gordon had filed to evict me for illegal drug activity, violation of the lease agreement. Everything was falling apart. My job called and said I was suspended pending investigation. Hospital policy meant any employee arrested for drug charges was immediately put on leave. I sat in my apartment, staring at the walls, understanding what had happened. Sokolov had orchestrated all of it. The drugs planted in my apartment, the police search, the arrest. He had connections everywhere. This was what happened to people who didn't stay quiet. They were destroyed systematically, every piece of their life dismantled. I had court in 3 weeks. My public defender was overworked and pessimistic. Said the drugs had been found in my apartment, that proving they'd been planted would be nearly impossible. I was looking at 2 to 5 years in prison. 2 days before my court date, I got a visitor. Eugene, the man Keisha had mentioned. He showed up at my door, a thin man in his 50s with tired eyes. He said Keisha had told him about me, about what had happened. He said he knew Sokolov had framed me. He's done it before. To anyone who threatens his operation, plants evidence, uses his police connections to make arrests happen. I asked why he was telling me this, and he said, "Because I'm tired of being scared. I'm going to testify against him, on record, with my recordings and documentation. Keisha's publishing the story tomorrow. I wanted to warn you. When it comes out, Sokolov will know you were part of it, even if you didn't give testimony." I said I wasn't part of it, that I'd refuse to help. Eugene said, "It won't matter. He'll think you were, and he'll retaliate." He handed me a card. "This is a lawyer. She handles cases like yours, cases where evidence has been planted. She's good and she's willing to work pro bono if you're willing to testify against Sokolov." I took the card with shaking hands. Eugene left and I sat there trying to decide what to do. If I testified, I'd probably still go to prison on the drug charges. Sokolov's connections could make sure of that. But if I didn't testify, people like Vera would keep suffering. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Vera, about 30 years of paying for a debt that should have ended decades ago, about all the other people trapped in the same cycle, about the fact that I was probably going to prison anyway, whether I testified or not. I called the lawyer whose card Eugene had given me. Her name was Simone Driscoll, and she answered on the second ring despite it being past midnight. I told her everything, the whole story from the beginning. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "I can't promise you won't face consequences for the drug charges, but I can promise I'll fight for you. And if you're willing to testify against Sokolov, if you're willing to go on record about what he did to you, we might be able to expose him in a way that actually matters." I said I'd testify. She said, "Good. I'll file motions tomorrow to get the drug charges dismissed based on evidence of police corruption and planted evidence. It's a long shot, but it's something. Keisha's article published the next morning. Front page of the city newspaper, above the fold. Loan shark operation runs unchecked for decades. Eugene's testimony was laid out in detail. The recordings of Sokolov's men threatening him. The documentation of payments going back 5 years. The story mentioned me, though not by name, describing a woman who'd been framed on drug charges after trying to help a victim. The article detailed how Sokolov used police connections to persecute people who interfered with his business. Within hours, the story went viral. Local news picked it up. National outlets started calling for interviews. The police department issued a statement saying they took allegations of corruption seriously and would be conducting an internal investigation. The district attorney announced he was opening a criminal investigation into Sokolov's operations. It felt like maybe, finally, something would actually happen. Then that night, Sokolov's men came for me. I was alone in my apartment when I heard the door burst open. 3 men, including the tall one who'd grabbed me before. They didn't say anything, just came at me. I tried to run, but they caught me, dragged me toward the door. I screamed and fought, knocking over furniture, desperately hoping someone would hear. Mrs. Kapoor's door opened. She stood in her doorway, phone in hand, speaking rapidly to what I hoped was 911. The men saw her and hesitated. Sirens in the distance, getting closer. They looked at each other, then ran, leaving me crumpled on the floor of my apartment. Police arrived within minutes. Different officers this time, ones I didn't recognize. They took my statement about the attempted kidnapping. Said they were issuing an arrest warrant for Sokolov and his associates immediately. Things moved fast after that. Sokolov was arrested the next day. Eugene, Vera, and I all gave testimony to the district attorney. Vera finally, after 30 years, told everything. How her husband had borrowed money, how Sokolov had trapped them in impossible debt, how she'd been paying for 3 decades with no end in sight, how he'd threatened to kill her if she ever spoke to police. The case against Sokolov was overwhelming. The recordings, the testimony, the documented threats. His lawyers tried every trick but couldn't make it go away. The trial lasted 3 weeks. I testified about the kidnapping, the forced signing of the false statement, the planted drugs. Eugene testified about his recordings and documentation. Vera testified about 30 years of exploitation. Other victims came forward, more than 20 people who'd been trapped in similar situations. The jury convicted Sokolov on racketeering, extortion, witness intimidation, and a dozen other charges. He was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. His associates got sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. My drug charges were dismissed after Simone proved police corruption in obtaining the warrant. The eviction notice was rescinded. I got my job back at the hospital with back pay. Vera's debt was declared void by a judge who ruled the original loan had been illegal and the compounding interest unconscionable. She cried when she got the ruling, actually cried with relief after 30 years of fear. I sat with her in her apartment that night and she kept saying, "It's over. It's really over." She asked what she was supposed to do now, how she was supposed to live without that weight. I said she was supposed to be free, to enjoy whatever years she had left without fear. 6 months later, Vera threw a party in her apartment. The first time in 30 years she'd invited anyone inside. Mrs. Kapoor came, and the college kids from 4B, and Gordon, and Keisha the reporter, and Eugene, and Simone my lawyer. We drank cheap wine and ate takeout pizza and celebrated the fact that sometimes, eventually, justice actually happens. Vera pulled me aside at one point and thanked me. Said if I hadn't been stubborn and naive and unwilling to mind my own business, she'd still be trapped. I said I was just glad she was free. She said, "You know what the best part is? I can knock on anyone's door anytime I want now. No more rules, no more fear." A year later, I still live in 3A. Vera is still in 3B, but now she leaves her door open sometimes, says hello in the hallways, smiles. The silence that used to define her apartment has been replaced by the sound of her television, her laughter, her life. Gordon told me last month he's glad I didn't listen when he said to stay out of it, that some rules deserve to be broken. I think about that sometimes, about the rule that I was told never to knock after midnight, about how following that rule would have meant letting evil continue unchecked, about how the most important thing I ever did was ignore a warning and knock anyway. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.